What if I told you that the Bible contains a curse so severe, so eternal, that it banned entire nations from God's presence forever, even to the 10th generation? Two peoples bore this unprecedented judgment. Born from shame in a mountain cave, they would become the architects of Israel's greatest spiritual downfall. Their gods demanded the unthinkable. Their kings sacrificed their own children on burning altars. And their legacy of rebellion runs so deep that prophecy itself declares them cursed until the end of time. This is the story of the Moabites and Ammonites, the most cursed peoples in biblical history. The Dead Sea shimmers under a merciless sun. Behind us, the smoking ruins of Sodom still stain the horizon. Ahead, jagged limestone cliffs hide a cave where an old man sits with his two daughters, completely unaware that what happens next will echo through 3,000 years of history. Lot stares into the darkness. His wife is gone, turned to salt for one backward glance. His world has collapsed in fire and brimstone. And his daughters, they're watching him with a calculating desperation that would make your skin crawl. You see, they believed humanity was finished, that they were the last three people alive on earth. The smoke rising from Sodom had convinced them that God's judgment was complete, total, apocalyptic. So they hatched a plan that would stain their bloodline forever. "There's no man left on earth to preserve our family line," the older daughter whispered to the younger. "Come, let's get our father drunk." What happened in that cave wasn't just incest. It was the birth of nations that would spend centuries trying to destroy God's chosen people. The older daughter bore a son she named Moab, literally meaning from father. A name so shameless it announced his illegitimate origins to the world. The younger daughter was slightly more tactful, naming her son Ben-Ami, son of my people. But here's what chills me about this story. The names themselves became prophecies. Moab, born of shameless scandal, would become a nation known for its brazen defiance of God. Ben-Ami, whose name at least attempted discretion, would father the Ammonites, a people whose cruelty was more calculated, more systematic. These weren't just illegitimate children. They were the founding fathers of nations whose DNA would be forever marked by rebellion, perversion, and an inexplicable hatred for everything holy. But here's where the story gets complicated. Despite their origin in that dark cave, God actually gave these peoples land, rich, fertile territories east of the Jordan River. The Moabites settled the highlands overlooking the Dead Sea, a region so prosperous that Isaiah would later call their village legendary, stretching even to the desert. The Ammonites claimed the northern plateau around what is now Amman, Jordan. Why would God grant inheritance to children born of sin? The answer reveals something profound about divine sovereignty. According to Deuteronomy, God told Moses, "Do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession." The same command applied to Ammon. But this wasn't blessing, it was strategic positioning. You see, before Lot's descendants arrived, these lands were inhabited by giants. The Emim, described as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim, terrorized the Moabite territory. The Zamzumim, equally fearsome, dominated what would become Ammon. God used the descendants of Lot as his instruments to drive out these Nephilim-like peoples. Think about that for a moment. God was using morally compromised nations to accomplish his purposes. The Moabites and Ammonites became unwitting tools of divine judgment against the giants, claiming territories through conquest, just as Israel would later claim Canaan. But receiving land didn't mean receiving favor, because while God granted them territory, he never granted them peace. From the moment they established their kingdoms around 1200 BC, they would exist in a state of perpetual tension with God's chosen people. They had land, but they would never have legitimacy. They had power, but they would never have divine blessing. They were nations living on borrowed time. Standing in the ruins of an ancient temple near Amman, archaeologists made a discovery that would haunt them for years. Thousands of charred human bones. mostly children. These weren't burial remains. They were the remnants of sacrificial fires that burned for centuries in honor of gods whose appetites could never be satisfied. The Ammonites worshipped Milcom, also known as Molech, a deity whose bronze furnace arms glowed red-hot as parrots fed their firstborn children to the flames. Can you imagine the sound? The screaming, the smell of burning flesh mixing with incense. The religious officials chanting as mothers and fathers performed the most unnatural act imaginable, all in the name of securing military victory or agricultural prosperity. But Molech wasn't the only monster these people served. The Moabites bowed before Chemosh, a war god whose stone altars ran red with the blood of captured enemies. When King Mesha of Moab faced defeat by Israel's army, he didn't surrender. He didn't negotiate. He climbed to the highest point of his city wall and sacrificed his own son, the crown prince, in full view of both armies. The biblical text records what happened next with chilling simplicity. There was great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Something supernatural occurred on that wall. Something so terrible that even God's chosen army fled in horror. This is the spiritual darkness we're dealing with. Nations whose religious practices were so abhorrent, so saturated with demonic power, that their very worship could turn the tide of battle. The Moabites and Ammonites didn't just reject the true God, they embraced gods that demanded the most precious sacrifices imaginable, and they gave willingly. Picture this scene. A desperate king paces the ramparts of his fortress, watching thousands of Hebrew warriors camped in the valley below. King Balak of Moab knows military strategy. He's counted the Israelite forces. He's seen what they did to the Amorites, to Og of Bashan. City after city has fallen before this unstoppable army led by an invisible God. So Balak makes a decision that reveals the spiritual warfare underlying this conflict. He turns to sorcery. But not just any sorcery. Balak hires Balaam, the most feared prophet for hire in the ancient world. A man whose curses were legendary, whose blessings could change the fate of nations. The king offers Balaam a fortune to speak one word, just one word, that would destroy Israel. 3 times they build altars. 3 times they offer sacrifices. 3 times Balaam opens his mouth to curse, and 3 times blessings pour out instead. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? Balaam confesses, his own voice betraying him. The most powerful sorcerer in the known world has become a puppet in God's hands, forced to pronounce blessing over the very people he was paid to destroy. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. Balaam may have failed to curse Israel, but he didn't give up. Unable to use spiritual warfare directly, he devised something far more insidious. He taught the Moabites and Ammonites a strategy that would nearly work: seduce God's people into sin. "Send your most beautiful women," Balaam whispered to Balak. "Invite the Hebrew men to your festivals. Let them taste your food, enjoy your wine, experience your hospitality. And when their defenses are down, introduce them to Baal-Peor." The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. While Israel camped in the plains of Moab, Moabite women began appearing at the edges of their camp. Beautiful, alluring, friendly. They brought gifts, shared stories, offered companionship to men who had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. The Hebrew men, far from their wives and families, were easy targets. But this wasn't just about physical temptation. The Moabite women were trained in something far more dangerous: the art of spiritual seduction. They invited their Hebrew lovers to festivals honoring Baal-Peor, a fertility god whose worship involved ritual prostitution and sacred orgies. "Come," they whispered. "What's the harm in one celebration? Your God doesn't have to know." But their God did know, and he was furious. Within days, a plague swept through the Israelite camp. 24,000 men died as divine judgment fell like a hammer. The sin wasn't just adultery, it was spiritual adultery. These men hadn't just slept with foreign women, they had bowed before foreign gods, eaten food sacrificed to idols, participated in rituals that mocked everything sacred. The plague only stopped when Phinehas, grandson of Aaron, took a spear and killed an Israelite man who was brazenly bringing a Midianite woman into the sacred camp. The man died mid-sin, and God's wrath was finally satisfied. But the damage was done. 24,000 of God's chosen people lay dead because of a strategy conceived by the Moabites and Ammonites. This is why they became the most cursed peoples in biblical history. They didn't just oppose God's people, they nearly destroyed them from within. After the catastrophe at Baal-Peor, God spoke words that would reverberate through every generation of Hebrew history. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever. Let that word sink in. This wasn't a temporary punishment. This wasn't a sentence that could be appealed or reduced for good behavior. God was declaring these peoples permanently, eternally excluded from his presence. The reasoning was explicitly stated. Because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam to curse you. But there's more to this curse than divine anger. There's profound theological significance. While other nations, even Egypt, which enslaved Israel for 4 centuries, could be accepted after 3 generations, the Moabites and Ammonites were banned forever. Egypt, despite its oppression, had at least recognized Israel's God during the plagues. The Amalekites, despite their cruelty, fought like warriors. But the Moabites and Ammonites had committed something worse than violence. They had corrupted worship itself. They had turned the sacred into the profane, the holy into the abominable. They had weaponized sexuality and spirituality in a way that struck at the very heart of God's covenant relationship with his people. This curse would define their destiny for over 1,000 years. The curse didn't make the Moabites and Ammonites disappear. Instead, it made them dangerous. Generation after generation, they rose against Israel like waves against a seawall. During the time of the judges, King Eglon of Moab, described as grotesquely obese, enslaved Israel for 18 years. His reign ended when the judge Ehud drove a dagger so deep into the king's belly that the fat closed over the blade and the weapon disappeared completely. The Ammonites were equally brutal. They allied with the Amalekites to oppress eastern Israel, torturing their enemies in ways that horrified even hardened warriors. The prophet Amos records that they ripped open pregnant women in Gilead, a level of cruelty that defies comprehension. But perhaps the most revealing conflict came during King David's reign. When the Ammonite king Nahash died, David sent ambassadors to offer condolences to his son Hanun. It was a gesture of diplomacy, possibly even genuine grief. Nahash may have shown David kindness during his exile. Hanun's response reveals everything about the Ammonite mindset. He accused the Hebrew ambassadors of being spies, had half their beards shaved off, and cut their robes at the buttocks. The humiliation so severe it was tantamount to a declaration of war. But here's what's chilling. Hanun immediately hired Syrian mercenaries, knowing his insult would provoke retaliation. The Ammonites preferred war to peace, conflict to cooperation. They chose hostility even when offered friendship. David's response was swift and merciless. His army besieged Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, for 2 years. When the city finally fell, David placed the crown of the Ammonite king on his own head, a crown that weighed a talent of gold, roughly 75 pounds. Then he subjected the population to forced labor with saws, iron picks, and brick kilns. It was a level of retribution that matched the crime. In 1955, archaeologist J.B. Hennessy was excavating near Amman's airport when he uncovered something that made him physically ill: a temple. Ancient, massive, and filled with the charred remains of thousands of human sacrifices. The structure dated to around 1300 BC, roughly the time of Moses and Joshua. At its center sat 2 circular stone altars, blackened by centuries of fire, Surrounding them were pottery fragments, jewelry, Egyptian scarabs, and bones. Lots of bones. Over 90% were human, most were children. Hennessy's report reads like a horror novel. There is no doubt that the principal ritual at the Ammon temple was the burning of human beings. The bone fragments showed clear evidence of being burned at extremely high temperatures, the kind of heat produced by deliberate cremation, not accidental fire. This wasn't a burial site. It was a furnace. The discovery provided archaeological proof of what the Bible had been saying for 3 millennia. The Ammonites really did sacrifice children to their god Molech. Those bronze arms, glowing red hot, those screaming infants, those desperate parents believing their child's death would purchase divine favor. It all happened right there in that temple outside modern Amman. But the horror doesn't end with ancient history. In 1868, a Bedouin shepherd stumbled across a black basalt stone covered with ancient writing near the Jordanian town of Diban. It was the discovery of the century. The Mesha stele, also called the Moabite stone, contained 34 lines of text in the Moabite language, carved by order of King Mesha around 840 BC. For the first time in modern history, archaeologists could read the other side of a biblical story, and what they read was chilling. Mesha's inscription boasts about his victory over Israel, crediting his god Chemosh with the triumph. Chemosh was angry with his land, so he gave it to the house of Omri, king of Israel. But I have triumphed over him and his house, and Israel has perished forever. The stone goes on to describe Mesha's construction projects, his military campaigns, and, most significantly, his religious practices. At one point, Mesha writes, "I took from there the vessels of Yahweh, and I presented them before Chemosh." He was looting Israel's sacred objects and offering them to his pagan god. But the most disturbing passage comes near the end. "I fought against the city and took it. I devoted all of it to destruction. 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and female servants, for I had devoted it to Ashtar Chemosh." 7,000 people, killed as a religious offering. This is the archaeological proof of what the Bible records in 2 Kings 3. The war where Mesha sacrificed his own son and created such spiritual horror that even Israel's army fled. The Mesha stele shows us that human sacrifice wasn't an aberration among the Moabites. It was policy. The prophets didn't mince words when they spoke of Moab and Ammon. Isaiah's oracle against Moab reads like a funeral dirge. "My heart cries out for Moab, her fugitives flee as far as Zoar. Waters of Nimrim are desolate, the grass is withered, the vegetation is gone, and nothing green remains." Jeremiah went further, pronouncing judgment so complete it defied imagination. "Moab will be destroyed and broken down. Wail for him, cry, announce by the Arnon that Moab is devastated." But it's Zephaniah who delivers the most terrifying prophecy of all. "Moab shall become like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a land possessed by nettles and salt pits, and a waste forever." Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities destroyed by fire from heaven, the ultimate symbol of divine judgment. That's the fate pronounced on the descendants of Lot, the same man who barely escaped Sodom's destruction. His own bloodline would suffer the same fate as the cities he fled. Yet even in judgment, there are hints of mercy. Both Jeremiah's prophecies against Moab and Ammon end with unexpected words. "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days. I will restore the fortunes of the Ammonites in the latter days." What could this mean? How can cursed peoples have their fortunes restored? The prophet Daniel received visions that have puzzled scholars for over 2 millennia. In chapter 11, he describes the final campaign of the Antichrist. "He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt." But then comes this startling detail, "But these shall escape from his hand, Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites." Wait, what? How can peoples who were cursed forever, who were compared to Sodom and Gomorrah, who were banned from God's presence until the 10th generation. How can they escape when the entire world falls under the Antichrist's dominion? This is one of biblical prophecy's greatest mysteries. Some scholars suggest this survival is strategic, that God preserves these territories not to bless their inhabitants, but to save them for a final, decisive judgment at the hands of restored Israel. Isaiah 11 verse 14 seems to support this view. They shall swoop down on the shoulder of the Philistines in the west, and together they shall plunder the people of the east. They shall put forth their hand against Edom and Moab, and the Ammonites shall obey them. Others see this as evidence of God's ultimate mercy, that even the most cursed peoples will somehow be included in the final restoration of all things. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more profound. Maybe their survival demonstrates that God's judgments, however severe, are never his final word. That curse, however eternal it seems, cannot ultimately overcome the Creator's love for his creation. Standing in the ruins of Rabbah, looking across the hills where Abraham once walked, you can feel the weight of 3,000 years of broken history. The Moabites and Ammonites were more than Israel's enemies. They were symbols, living reminders of what happens when people choose darkness over light, rebellion over submission, curse over blessing. Their origins in that cave near Sodom marked them from birth. Their worship of gods who demanded child sacrifice revealed hearts capable of the unthinkable. Their seduction of Israel at Baal-Peor proved they would use any weapon, even sexuality and spirituality, to accomplish their goals. But most significantly, they represent the tragedy of proximity without relationship. They lived next to God's chosen people for over a millennium. They witnessed miracle after miracle. They saw the walls of Jericho fall, watched David defeat Goliath, observed Solomon's unprecedented wisdom and wealth. They had front-row seats to the greatest display of divine power in human history. And they chose to oppose it. That's why the curse was so severe. Not because they were ignorant, but because they were willfully blind. Not because they didn't know better, but because they did know better and chose rebellion anyway. They are cursed not for their ignorance, but for their knowledge, not for their weakness, but for their defiance. In the end, the Moabites and Ammonites serve as eternal warnings. Proximity to blessing doesn't guarantee participation in blessing. Witnessing God's power doesn't automatically translate to worshiping God's person. Sometimes the closest neighbors become the most distant enemies. Sometimes family becomes the most dangerous foe. And sometimes curse becomes so complete, so total, that only a divine intervention beyond our comprehension can reverse it. That intervention may be coming. The prophets suggest it will. But until then, the ruins scattered across Jordan's hills stand as silent testimony to a truth that echoes through every generation. Those who set themselves against the purposes of God will discover that no fortress is strong enough, no alliance powerful enough, no strategy clever enough to prevail against the one who spoke the universe into existence. The most cursed peoples in biblical history learned this lesson the hardest way possible. Their story continues to teach it today.